but that's leaving a whole generation unhappy in the long run, miserable, in fact, because they don't have families, they don't have meaningful relationships, and they look back at their lives of doing all the things they wanted to do in the moment and realizing that none of it really mattered in the long run. Whereas we can see in the research people who get their education and really stick it out, who work hard and pursue gainful employment, who get married and have children. In fact, the more children, the better in some cases. Those are the people the happiest at the end of their lives, and not surprisingly, I think, but maybe surprisingly to some, are the wealthiest. So they're the wealthiest financially, and I would say, spiritually or emotionally.
Like the most fulfilled.
Yeah,
So I have a theory, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, and it will be a little bit controversial. I'll just tell you that before I
sure.
start. Um, I think that African Americans, so this whole thing started in the 1920s. That is when the USSR came to America and started to infiltrate the Black churches and to change their biblical justice perspective to a social justice one. Before then, African Americans were starting to be upwardly mobile. As somebody who's
Yeah,
half African American, I had not heard the stories of successes growing up in our schools. I think that was intentional. Um, but what I see is this guinea pig practice. So the failures, the breaking down the family unit, the telling these people that they're victims and that the world, just constantly look back into the worst thing that's ever happened to your grandparents or your great
hmm
grandparents, and hold on to that grievance. Now,
hmm
but here's the reality is that when they hold on to this grievance, then the rest of society says, I don't want to be anything like them.
yeah,
This, I'm blunt here, okay? So they say, I don't want to be anything like them. But then you take every practice that you did that was done to these people. And this is not me saying victimhood, black power type. I'm saying that I can acknowledge that something was wrong and I can want to right those wrongs. And I can say that instead of righting those wrongs, people are going, ding, 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 we figured this out. Now let's impose it on everyone else.
yeah,
So we teach our kids through ethnic studies, through curriculums, through every grievance study from feminist issues, gender issues, whatever the
yes,
issue. We teach them, you are a victim, you should hold on to the grievance. And then what you make are dependent, infantilized, and angry people.
yes. You put it very well. I think that's very accurate. Charlie Kirk was, uh, dragged through the mud by people after his death for saying similar things. They took him out of context. I wrote a whole piece about how Sharon McMahon completely took Charlie Kirk out of context, and that's why she should have not been the commencement speaker. And I'm glad she's not, although she's welcome to speak whenever she likes. But you're exactly right, and I think I really first learned this from Charlie Kirk, and then it's been reinforced to me by members of the African American community that if you look back at the African American community in the 60s and 70s, what really defined that community at the time was family and hard work,
And faith.
um, and and faith, absolutely. And they were taking radical responsibility for their own success despite the challenges of the time. And then after the civil rights movement, they were told, you're not responsible for where you're at. The government's responsible. And all these programs and incentives were set up with possibly, good intentions. But what it ultimately ended up doing was incentivizing the destruction of the family and incentivizing the destruction of the faith and the unity of the Black community. And I think it's really sad to see that those same tactics that the government used, under Lyndon Johnson to
Mhm.
try to really help the Black community ended up really hurting them, are being used on our students today and are being used on women and on every marginalized group as if to perpetuate the victimhood mentality and to remove responsibility and accountability, which that's another one of the hard truths conservatives have to say. And we need to say it, that no matter what your circumstances are, no matter what injustices you faced, you are ultimately responsible for your destiny. And in America, you have a place where you can take control of your destiny, even if it's an uphill battle. Obviously, we should try to make sure there's an even playing field and make sure there isn't discrimination in the system. But bottom line is, even if there is, because the system will always be imperfect, you
Mhm.
have responsibility. And people who take radical responsibility for their lives tend to be happier and they tend to be more successful regardless of where they started. And I think people like Dr. Ben Carson are great examples of this.